Hi, my name is Bill Schaefer, and our book review today is Life During the Black Death by John M. Dunn. This is part of the Way People Live series. The Way People Live series is an educational series of books for high school or middle school, and I like them. I find them quite educational and readable. And I've read a few of the books in the series, including Life During the Russian Revolution and several others. But this book turned out to be particularly captivating because the stories were so unusual. You probably remember the details that the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, first entered Europe in 1347. And it was spread by fleas on rats, and the rats came in the ships and disembarked to the towns, and the fleas spread to other rats, and within a few years a third of the population of the entire earth was killed, died. 1/3 of the population of Europe died from the plague, and 1/3 of the population of the entire rest of the world also died from the plague. And this was upsetting to the stability of European culture and signaled a change from medieval life to the current life, the current society that we're living in. And that is what I found interesting, because for about 800 to 1,000 years from the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe had developed a pretty stable feudal culture that was ruled and governed by the church. And within a few years, this stability was totally upended. And that's why this period of time was interesting. I knew nothing about it. A few of the consequences were, before the plague, there was a rigid social hierarchy. And the aristocrats wore a certain type of fine linen or fine cloth that the peasants were not allowed to wear. And this distinguished them as a class from the peasants. And because Europe was very populous, there were a lot of peasants. About 90% of the population were peasants, serfs, virtual slaves. They were slaves to the land. And about 10% were the aristocratic landlords, or the nobility or royalty. And just starting was the merchant class. The traders and artisans were just starting to have a role in the economy. Well, when 1/3 of the population of Europe died, this left a shortage of workers and an abundance of wealth. Entire villages were left abandoned and empty, and with all the wealth in the houses intact. And so robbers and brigands would break into houses that were abandoned to steal the wealth. And squatters would leave the land that they were trapped on and move somewhere else and set up life in a new empty house or empty village. So all the adhesion, the social adhesion that kept people in their place, was loosened. The peasants started buying and wearing the finer cloth that the aristocrats had used to distinguish themselves from the peasants. And they tried to enact ordinances to prevent this, but it happened anyway. The peasants got together and organized for higher wages, and they left jobs for higher wages, and they got paid higher wages because the work needed to be done. And again, the aristocratic class was outraged that these peasants would dare to improve their class. And this was the beginning of the modern economy of modern Europe and the end of feudalism. Now, another interesting consequence of this was that no one knew how the plague was transmitted. They knew nothing about germs or viruses or bacteria, and they certainly knew nothing about sanitation and health, and it was just a mystery. And as a consequence, people died. Now, up to that time, the practice of medicine had been based on the doctrines of Aristotle from 1500 years earlier. And for 1,000 years, medicine was an unchanging practice based on the questionable doctrines of Aristotle in regard to health. There was no experimentation. In fact, the church had closed all the universities 800 or 1,000 years earlier. But the doctors were absolutely helpless to cure people, to prevent symptoms, or prevent the spread of the disease. The doctors of the time were powerless to stop the spread of the bubonic plague or the Black Death. This led to an eventual change in the entire medical establishment, where they started doing research and experimentation, practicing on medicines that worked, and practicing on developing a theory of medicine that actually worked. And this event marked the end of the old medieval way of doing medicine and started the very beginnings of scientific. Also, the church. Now, the church purports to interpret and divine the will of God, and to also entreat God's favor for the parishioners. But the clergy were absolutely powerless to stop the spread of the Black Death. And they were powerless to explain what was happening and why it was happening. And no matter what they tried and what they did, people kept dying. And 1/3 of the population of Europe eventually died. And this Black Death spread town by town by town. So the towns in England heard about it happening 2 or 3 years before it actually happened in England. So people knew it was coming, like the rumblings of a disaster on the horizon, but they were powerless to stop it. And this led to a tremendous loss of prestige of the church and the clergy, that later resulted in the People's Rebellion. There were various peasants' revolts across Europe, and also indirectly to the Reformation and the Protestant Reformation, and along with other factors like the discovery of the New World, really broke the stranglehold that the church held on philosophy and thought and knowledge and politics during the entire Middle Ages. So a few things happened as society was totally unhinged from having so many people die and being absolutely unprepared to deal with it. Because you would get struck down with the first symptoms and slowly develop sores all over your body, but you were dead within 2 weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks, you were dead. And very, very few people survived that actually got the symptoms. Towards the end of this period, there broke out this religious fanatical movement of flagellants. They assumed that since God had sent this horrible plague to punish all the Europeans, that they would do penance. And this was a mass movement that many people joined, where they would whip themselves with whips until they would get the blood flowing, and they would do massive types of rituals of denigrating the flesh, suffering through fasting and self-abuse as kind of a penance, some type of spiritual penance to gain the favor of God, to stop this Black Death, or at least to spare them through their overt displays of spirituality and their overt displays of faith. And this was kind of freaky. And then these flagellants would go to like the graveyards and have ceremonies and outdoor meetings. And eventually this turned into, after the Black Death, all the people that survived these 4 years of horror and terror, all of them, their lives were upset. All of them had family members and people they knew that died. And they never knew when they would be next. And they just happened to be alive. So it became accustomed to have big parties and celebrations in the graveyards. And these were kind of like Mardi Gras, sacrilegious, earthy, hedonistic celebrations of the joy of life, and because we never knew when it would end. And these went on for 60 to 80 years before the church started clamping down and preventing these, because they developed more irreverent ribaldry as time went on. And after 100 years, this was stopped. But in any event, the book Life During the Black Death by John M. Dunn is a fascinating book. And it's got a few illustrations, and it's very readable, and it really explains the social trends, and it really explains the nature of life during the Black Death. So if you're interested in history, and you're interested in learning more about the bubonic plague, or any time in history, I highly recommend both Life During the Black Death and the entire series, The Way People Live. Thank you, and leave your comments below.